All right. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Alan MacLeod. He is a senior staff writer for Mint Press News, also a author of Bad News from Venezuela, 20 years of fake news and misreporting and propaganda in the information age, still manufacturing consent. Welcome to the podcast, Alan.
Great to be with you, Brianna.
So I wanted to talk to you today about this really bombshell new piece that you published in Mint Press News called Revealed: The Israeli Spies Writing America's News. Now, we have covered, of course, the intense pro-Israel bias in the mainstream American press, but this seems to be more comprehensive in a lot of ways and also more particular to the individual journalists that have been driving a lot of that coverage. So I want to give you the floor. Who are the Israeli spies who are writing America's news?
Sure, it's no secret that the US media displays a pretty serious one-sided bias when it comes to Israel-Palestine, and there's all sorts of theories as to why. Many of them have a lot of weight to it. But what I found in my research is that quite a lot of the most prestigious and influential people in America's newsrooms actually used to work for the Israeli government, and specifically in Israeli military intelligence in a notorious group called Unit 8200. Now, chief of those is Axios's Barak Ravid, who this year actually won the prestigious White House Press Correspondents' Dinner Award for the best journalism of 2024. And at that ceremony, he was embraced by Joe Biden. There were speeches given about how wonderful his reporting is and how precise and how much of an insider he is.
The Aldo Beckman Award for Overall Excellence in White House Coverage, named for a former association president, the late Chicago Tribune correspondent Aldo Beckman, goes to Barak Ravid of Axios. The judges said Barak Ravid's reporting displayed deep, almost intimate levels of sourcing in the United States and abroad that produced stories closely aligned to the events that subsequently transpired. His stories put the reader into the room as decisions were being made in the tumultuous aftermath of the October 7th Hamas-led raids on Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, the WHCA is pleased to give the Aldo Beckman Award to Barak Ravid.
Now, Ravid, if you look at his articles in Axios, he's probably the chief person who pushes this. Biden is getting really sick with Israel. Biden is distancing himself from Netanyahu, stuff that we've heard for more than 12 months now, without any real consequences happening. Biden, of course, said, if Israel goes into Rafah, that's the last straw. We're not supporting them after that. Well, Israel went to Rafah and much further, and the Biden administration is still there. So Ravid is an Israeli, but more importantly, he was, until at least 2023, a member of Unit 8200, which is an Israeli military spying organization. In 2023, he very publicly said he would no longer serve there after Netanyahu overstepped his mark, going after the opposition in Israel. Now, who are Unit 8200? They are Israel's most elite and perhaps most notorious military unit. Unit 8200 are responsible for cyber warfare, for clandestine operations, and for many of the most infamous incidents that we've seen in the past few years in the world of spying and intelligence, including the Lebanese pager attack, which killed many people and injured thousands of civilians. And ex-Unit 8200 agents were behind the Pegasus scandal, this software that was used to spy on tens of thousands of politicians, academics, journalists, activists all around the world, including the Washington Post Jamal Khashoggi, who the Saudi authorities were using Pegasus with permission from the Israeli government to spy on this guy, and then they dismembered him with a bone saw. So Unit 8200 is really the centerpiece of Israel's surveillance state. It is a daily reality for Palestinians that they are thrown into this massive dragnet of surveillance where their faces are being recorded constantly, where their every movement is being tracked, their texts, their calls with their relatives. All of this is being put into a huge Unit 8200 database. And this information is being used by this group to dredge up huge amounts of compromise on Palestinians. So, for example, if you are secretly a homosexual or if you are cheating on your spouse, Unit 8200 will know because they've got the receipts, and they will use that to influence you and try to turn you into an informant against your comrades and your neighbors and your relatives. Not only that, Unit 8200 is the centerpiece of the very, very controversial Lavender software, which assigns a score of between 1 and 100 to any Palestinian in Gaza. And the higher the number you are, the more likely they are in their estimation for you to be a Hamas supporter, a Hamas sympathizer, or a Hamas operative. And if your number goes above a certain level, you are automatically put on a kill list that Unit 8200 used, this AI-generated kill list in Gaza, to target tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza and turn that place into the world's biggest smoldering parking lot. So this is who Unit 8200 are. And there are a number of these former Unit 8200 journalists working in the United States. Ravid is one of them, but CNN also employs a number of them. For example, Shachar Paled, she spent 3 years as an officer in Unit 8200, leading a team of analysts in surveillance, intelligence, and cyber warfare. And then in 2017, she was hired as a producer for CNN to write segments for big shows like Christine Amanpour's show, like Fareed Zakaria's show. And then she later went on to work for Google. Another Unit 8200 operative who went to work for CNN is Tal Heinrich. She spent 3 years as a Unit 8200 agent, and then she became the news desk producer at CNN's Jerusalem bureau, where she actually produced and oversaw the news about Operation Protective Edge, which was the last time Israel started attacking Gaza. And so tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Americans would have seen content produced by Tal Heinrich, who I will remind you is a former Israeli spy, that is being, sent to huge numbers of people all around the world as supposedly objective, factual reporting, when it is anything but. And it goes, beyond this. Of course, last year, I know you're aware of this, the New York Times hired Anat Schwartz, this ex-Israeli Air Force intelligence official who had zero journalistic experience. And she was brought into the Times so that she could report this ridiculous Screams Without Words dossier, which was almost immediately debunked by people in independent media. And it was so free of actual evidence about Hamas committing atrocities against women on October 7th that it actually caused something of an internal revolt at the New York Times. So, yeah, it is really extraordinary that people like this are allowed to just get jobs in a hyper-competitive industry. And we in the West, I've sort of been trained to see Israel as just like this sort of neutral state. Being in the Israeli military isn't, a problem. But I would ask anyone watching this to think, what if this was ex-officers in Russia's FSB or in Hezbollah intelligence? Would we think that was just normal for them to be working at CNN or the New York Times? I think the answer is no.
Yeah, this is really incredible. I read your piece kind of alongside this recent piece from Adam Johnson and Othman Ali from December 18th in The Nation titled How Sunday Morning News Shows Promote an Anti-Palestinian Agenda for Washington. And they did an analysis of the content on these shows, Meet the Press, ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Face the Nation, State of the Union at CNN. And they found that with the exception of one interview, Sunday news shows covered and debated the so-called Israel-Hamas war for 12 months without speaking to a single Palestinian or Palestinian American. With one exception, for a year, none of the major Sunday news shows even spoke to a Palestinian. On the other hand, on the other side of things, you're describing to me institutionally, an institutional reality that so many of the people who are writing and producing segments for these major programs aren't just Israeli or aren't just people who might, for other reasons, be sympathetic to Israel and have their own bias, but were in fact Israeli spies who operated within one of the most polarizing, I would argue, toxic segments of the Israeli military.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, there's no surprise to most people who've been following this that there is a huge bias there. That, of course, comes from the top down in the sense that the United States is a very close ally of Israel, and it's very rare for big corporate media outlets that are somewhat aligned with the United States government to really challenge Washington on anything substantial. But it's also the case that individual journalists inside the organizations are really not willing to do that, specifically because they have skin in the game, that they actually were participants in this. And it goes right to the top. I mean, if you look at the sorts of people who actually control a lot of these organizations, I mean, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, he volunteered to be a prison guard in the IDF during the Second Palestinian Intifada. And he actually, in his memoirs, revealed that he helped cover up prisoner abuse at that time and has faced zero consequences for it.
This is
Meanwhile, the United
Jeffrey Goldberg.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And he says he's helped to cover up prisoner abuse.
That's what it says in his memoirs, that he talks about the abuse that's going on in these Israeli prisons, which frankly shouldn't surprise many people. And also probably not so surprising for people who actually cover this is that the IDF units that were actually perpetrating these crimes really faced basically no consequences for it. But this goes right to the top. I mean, the New York Times, I mean, their Jerusalem bureau, they own a property that was stolen from a prominent Palestinian family in the 1948 Nakba. You know, her name is Ghada Kamini, and we've interviewed her at Mint Press News, and the New York Times is aware of this. But you know that their outlet is actually directly participating in the ongoing displacement of Palestinians, shows that they are taking a side in this. And of course, lots of New York Times columnists actually have relatives that have served in the IDF, and they're proud of that. They're boasting about it. But that sort of thing, if it was going on the other side, you know, we've seen so many journalists lose their jobs because of taking mildly pro-Palestinian or mildly anti-Israel positions, criticizing Israel as an apartheid state, etc., etc. This is happening across the board in the West. And yet when people are revealed to be actually, you know, agents of Israeli or former agents of Israeli spying institutions or Israeli military, or another piece I wrote recently, which was called "Revealed the Israeli Lobbyists Writing America's News," found hundreds of people who used to work at institutions like the Anti-Defamation League or AIPAC, who are now in senior positions in management, in production, all across America's newsrooms. So it's institutional as well as systemic.
You open your piece with Barak Ravid in particular. This one journalist who, as you pointed out, was rewarded by President Biden last year for exceptional journalism. I don't want to skate over the sort of methodology behind the madness here. You know, what the effect of the kind of reporting he does is, because for people who might not be so online or might not pay that much attention to bylines, they might not understand the impression that is given by the kinds of headlines that Barak Ravid typically writes. And you alluded to it a little bit, but I just want to make sure we're really clear about it. I'm going to just read off a couple of examples from your article, and then I would love you to explain what you think these headlines are in service of, what the ultimate goals are. So here's some examples. Scoop: Biden tells Bibi he's not in it for a year of war in Gaza. Scoop: White House cancels meeting, scolds Netanyahu in protest over video. Biden running out of patience with Bibi as Gaza war hits 100 days. Biden-Bibi clash escalates as U.S. accused of undermining Israeli government. Biden and Bibi red lines for Rafah, put them on a collision course. Biden on hot mic told Bibi we need come to Jesus meeting on Gaza. What's the effect of these headlines?
Sure. I mean, they are based on anonymous State Department or White House officials telling Ravid this, apparently. But they're the actual reason for them to be published and the output and what they actually do to the American public is to try to distance the Biden administration from the horrors of what's going on in Gaza. The reality is that the Biden administration has stood shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu and the Israeli government throughout these atrocities, this ongoing genocide that is going on. And it is paying the price on the world stage where the United States global public opinion has been falling drastically in the past 14 months. These articles serve as a way to try to whitewash American complicity in this genocide and to try to shift the Biden administration away from their very clear support of a genocide and make it look like they're an honest broker, a neutral party who's just trying to do the best, trying to, do something for peace, and trying to make them look like they're not as guilty and as complicit in genocide as they truly are.
Yeah, and you see this narrative really embraced by a lot of liberal Zionists too, especially over the course of the last 14 months. I cannot deny the gravity of the humanitarian situation, the reality of the genocide in Gaza. So the pivot has been to, as the cognitive dissonance starts to ratchet up, well, it's not Israel, it's Netanyahu. And as soon as Netanyahu is gone, the fundamental project is going to be okay. And when you listen to more sort of progressive outlets, like a kind of a Pod Save America, neoliberal progressive outlets, you see them really leaning hard on this idea that it's really about Bibi. I don't know, a lot of people in the audience might have listened to the Pod Save interview with Hassan Piker, for instance. And there's an exchange where I think it's John Levitz pushes back a little bit. It can't really say, no, you're wrong, Hassan, about the genocide and the gravity of it all. But, Netanyahu, it's really Netanyahu. Maybe we can get that clip in here.
Yes, Israel is responsible for Israel's actions, but we do need to separate Benjamin Netanyahu and his conduct from the Israeli people. In the same, that doesn't mean they're not responsible in the same way that America is not George W. Bush, right? But America is responsible for what George W. Bush, when he is in command of our armed forces.
Yeah.
But we understand that distinction.
Of course. The problem is you have to also look at the Overton window, though, in any society, in any culture, in any country, right? And I think that, and I come from, I'm Turkish. Like, I come from a country with conscription. Like, I understand what ultranationalism is. I've lived through it. I've experienced it. I know what it's like when Turkish people hear me say like that the Armenian genocide is real, for example. Like, that's like a non-starter, right? That's like, you can't say that. What are you talking about? I learned in school that it wasn't real, right? Like, I understand how a country can become more and more right-wing, where even the liberal position is still committed to the maintenance of an apartheid. And I think that is where we're at with Israel, and we have to restrain Israel as we are the number one partner of Israel, whether it be the weapons that we give to Israel, whether it be the financial support that we give to Israel, or whether it be the trade partnership that we have, or the financial partnership that we have with Israeli companies. We have a lot of influence over what Israel does.
And so when you see how crucial that argument is to folks who want to continue to defend Biden and his Bear Hug Bibi strategy, want to continue to defend the Democratic Party, want to put space between the Democratic Party and what Biden has enabled over the last 14 months, these kinds of articles are in direct service to that. And then thinking about that and reflecting on Biden literally wrapping his arms around Barack Ravid at, the Correspondents' Dinner earlier this year, really raises some red flags about what these so-called independent institutions are really doing and how they're serving the public versus our political structures. I want to also give you an opportunity to go into more detail on what Unit 8200, 8,000, how are we saying this number? 8200 is kind of understood and sort of esteemed in Israeli society, so we get a better picture of how broad the reach is and why so many people who have served in that intelligence capacity end up in such sort of elite places in American institutions.
So in Israel, everyone has to serve in the military. It's mandatory. But you certainly don't get picked for Unit 8200 by mistake or by accident. It's described as Israel's Harvard. And the reason is Israel's got this burgeoning tech industry, which is known worldwide. And where do all of these recruits come from? It's actually from Unit 8200. That's where they come in, because this is where all of this military technology and all of these startups are incubated and then they're sent out into the world. So you will find that very rich parents spend tens of thousands of dollars in some cases for lessons for their children so that they can pass the exams, so that they get chosen for Unit 8200. And the reason is that they know that if they spend 3 years in there, they are going to make the connections to mean that they will get jobs in the tech industry in some of these really big Israeli companies, or later on, maybe in Google, maybe in Amazon. So other investigations I found that literally hundreds of Unit 8200 ex-officials at Unit 8200 now work at all the big social media companies like Google, like Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. I found, for example, that there are at least 99 former Unit 8200 veterans currently serving at Google. And that is certainly an undercount, because it's actually under Israeli law an offense to reveal that you were either currently or previously in Unit 8200. So those are the people that I was able to find on LinkedIn, brazenly flouting Israeli law, saying, yeah, I used to be an Israeli spy and now I'm working at Google. So the real number is going to be much, much larger. So yeah, Unit 8200 is like the centerpiece of the Israeli surveillance state, and people compete. The competition is absolutely tenacious to try and get in there, because once you've got your foot in the door there, that opens up so many opportunities for high-paid jobs in the tech industry. And that's why it's considered the most elite unit in the Israeli military.
So it's not even necessarily the case that, these tech companies are actively recruiting because of sympathies with Israel's politics, and that's why so many people ended up there. This feels almost like one of those passive Chomsky-ish observations that you don't have to be wanting to have a certain kind of bias if the institutions are set up so that there's a sort of a pathway, a likelihood that you're going to end up in positions of power and have the position and have the opinions that you do, so that the value of tech and surveillance outside of a military context and the elite nature of those kind of careers, and parents in Israel wanting their kids to have certain kind of successes, mean that they are naturally funneled up through a system in which they are trained as Israeli spies and then exported across the world, because Israel is known as having this really robust tech sector. I'm curious how you went about doing your research, since it's the case that you're not supposed to say that you're in Unit 8200. You've mentioned that some people have flouted that rule, but have you been able to try to figure out how far this goes, how deep this goes through other sorts of means? I mean, tell me about your process a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you touched on something really important that I'll just touch on there. I'm not saying that this is some sort of grand conspiracy for Israeli agents to try to like filter in into big social media companies or big elite media outlets like CNN. What I'm saying is that actually being a member of the Israeli military, even the most controversial units that are involved in the spying and the sort of AI driven slaughter that's going on in Gaza, even that is not considered particularly controversial in elite American circles. It seems to be about as controversial as if you were, for example, an ex-Marine or an ex-US Navy person trying to get a job in a newsroom. It's not going to hold you back. Whereas if you've got public posts on your Facebook saying Free Palestine, or sharing Amnesty International articles condemning Israel, that is going to be a block on your journalistic career or your career at Google or wherever. How I went about doing the research, I'm not some sort of super tech savvy guy. Honestly, you just see something like Barak Ravid saying publicly on his Twitter that he's no longer serving in Unit 8200. And it gets you thinking, really? I can't believe anyone would do that. And so you just start very simply going to employment databases like ZoomInfo or LinkedIn and start typing very interesting things like Unit 8200 CNN or Unit 8200 Facebook and seeing what comes up. And a lot of my journalism actually revolves around just doing basic searches in LinkedIn. For instance, doing stuff like Facebook CIA or TikTok
Mm.
NATO. And the level and just the amount of people that will come up in senior positions in a lot of these organizations will make anyone's hair stand on end. And I would advise anyone with a LinkedIn account to just start doing that and see the sorts of people who come up. And yeah, as I said, just writing Unit 8200 into LinkedIn and then looking at the companies that these people now work in, it's really mind-boggling that this is all going on completely above ground, completely in the open. Anybody could look at this. And what's interesting is that the people in corporate media, they obviously know that their bosses were Israeli soldiers or Israeli spies. I mean, they probably talk about it. You're telling me you've never looked at your boss's LinkedIn before. And yet nobody in corporate media and CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, wherever, seems to think that this is a story. And I think that is actually, in some ways, a bigger marker and a bigger damning comment about our entire media ecosystem as a one, that there isn't a single journalist in corporate media that thought that this was a problem beforehand, even after a month and a year of genocide that we've been seeing, and nobody's covering this. It really is pretty shocking to me.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I was planning to ask what the response has been to your piece.
In terms of just readership, a lot of people are very surprised. A lot of people really enjoyed a lot of the work that I've been putting out when it comes to the links between the fourth estate and the national security state, which can be seen in this sorts of overlap and this revolving door that we've got between either the US national security state or the Israeli national security state and our media, whether that's old media or social media. But in general, it's been met with pretty much a collective yawn when it comes to corporate media. In fact, to the point where it was actually number 2 on Project Censored's list of most ignored stories of 2023, I believe. So this is a story which a lot of people think is extremely important, but it's also a story which corporate media is just refusing to touch.
Well, their hands are extremely dirty and they're very culpable. I mean, I'm really interested in this sort of, again, it's not a grand conspiracy theory, but this reality that the tech sector seems so implicated here. There's so many people in the tech sector who have worked for Unit 8200. Mint Press also did this investigation that showed that a large proportion of the worldwide VPN market is owned and operated by an Israeli company that's headed and co-founded by Unit 8200 alums. What's the implications of that? And for those of us that are Luddites, what does it mean? What's a VPN?
Well, more than 1.6 billion people around the world use VPNs to carry out a lot of sensitive tasks online. VPN is basically a client which allows you to hide your true IP address, your true location in the world, and pretend that you're somewhere else. You might want to do this, for example, to get around laws in your country about viewing certain things or doing certain things online. So actually, very often people use VPNs to carry out the most sensitive tasks they'll do, like, for example, communicating with people, engaging in sexual or political activities, buying things, watching banned or illegal videos, accessing banned websites, etc., etc. But a lot of people, so how VPNs work basically is that instead of giving that information over to your internet service provider as usual, you give it to a VPN company, and that will mask your true identity, and you'll give all of your sensitive data to them, and they will send your internet service provider a load of random stuff saying that you're in Mexico or Argentina or Bolivia or Russia or wherever you want to be. Now, the thing is that you're still giving that sensitive information over to that VPN company, and you're essentially saying that you trust them over your internet service provider. So the problem is that we've been talking about Unit 8200 and how it creates these massive digital dragnets to carry out operations on Palestinians. And they were also behind a lot of the most infamous spying and hacking software out there, including Pegasus, which is a way to hack into people's phones and surveil them, whether they're in, Belgium, Botswana, Bangladesh, or Bolivia. All around the world that this is happening, and you don't even know it's happening. So it is very worrying that from the exact same organization that is producing all of this spyware, there's also producing all the stuff that's meant to keep you safe online. And so 3 out of the top 6 VPNs in the world are quietly owned by an Israeli company with close connections to Unit 8200. In fact, they were co-founded and still headed by a former Unit 8200 officer. That means that we are effectively giving people who are just out of the Israeli military intelligence all of this extremely sensitive data. And so I think while I'm not saying there's any evidence that necessarily means that, this is a massive sting operation, I do think that people who are politically active online should probably at least know that kind of information, that that's the sort of thing that they're giving. That's the sort of group that they are giving their most sensitive data to if they're going to be doing things that are potentially illegal online.
I mean, what do you do with that information? I mean, where is there to go?
When you say what do you do with that information, do you mean if you're from the big company, or if you're from or if you're an
No.
individual?
If you're an activist, an organizer, someone who's having sensitive conversations, someone who might be of political interest to the government, it does increasingly feel like so many of the options, the technological alternatives that are supposed to be protecting our privacy and the like, are either poorly designed and compromises for those reasons, or perhaps are, have some ownership structure that causes there to be some level of distrust, which of course it's not necessarily the case, right? It's not necessarily true. You've been very clear that this isn't some grand conspiracy, and it might just be the case that people who happen to be at one of the most prestigious, people who are very, very good at tech end up in the very prestigious tech environment, which happens to be this spy organization, and then they filter out into all these other kinds of organizations afterward. But it is worrisome. It is a significant red flag. And sometimes I do feel overwhelmed when I read these stories thinking, well, is there any place to go? Or are we supposed to just be, kind of sending each other smoke signals, or meeting in person, or writing handwritten letters? Or, I don't know, they're trying to get rid of UPS now. So I don't know if I can even trust the snail mail with the privacy of my correspondence anymore. So, I mean, what do you do? How are you thinking about this?
I think the reality is that we've always been sold a bill of goods when it comes to the internet, that this is somehow this magical communication device which nobody is looking at. It's never been the case. The reality is that you have to be aware that you're not going to be able to defeat or combat some of the biggest organizations and governments in the world with some app that you were given for free, that's in your pocket and in your phone. That's just simply not how it works. And you do have to be wary that pretty much everything you do online could be hacked into and could be being surveilled, especially if you're, a political person. So yeah, I think in terms of having really important meetings, face-to-face is generally the way to go. In terms of just the VPN thing, I mean, there are other companies out there which are not owned by Israeli companies or Israeli military intelligence aligned groups. So yeah, but I think we have to remember that a lot of the privacy-based software was actually even developed in coordination with the US government. For example, Signal, the communications app, and Tor, the web browser, were both funded and midwifed by the US national security state in the first place. And they were basically developed so that pro-US activists in other countries could communicate with each other or access the World Wide Web wherever they were in order to carry out pro-US operations wherever they were. That sort of stuff should be known. And yeah, as activists, as radicals or whatever, you have to realize that the sorts of tools that you want to use to change society are not just going to be given to you on a plate by the powers that be.
It's interesting because in the present political context, you have this bipartisan attack on TikTok as an outlet, and you have mentioned that Unit 8200 folks have worked over at the Anti-Defamation League. Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the Anti-Defamation League, has been very vocal and forward about wanting a TikTok ban. There was this like leaked conversation in which he was very specific about how the pro-Palestinian messaging on TikTok is a big part of why he wanted there to be a TikTok ban. TikTok ban, actually, of course, was successful. You wrote back at the end of last month an article called "TikTok Isn't Anti-Israel." It hired Unit 8200 agents to run its affairs. What should we know there? Because it does seem like the content, at very least, because it is unpoliced in the way that corporate media is, runs very favorable to the interests of Palestinians and their allies. But the institution itself seems to be making different kinds of political choices in its hiring, or maybe not. What do you make of it?
Well, first of all, I think we should remember that if we're talking on a global level, the pro-Palestinian cause is overwhelmingly popular, and the US and Israeli position is at one extreme that is not shared by many countries in the world. Just look at the United Nations votes, for example, when it comes to condemning Israel for its crimes or promoting a Palestinian state. The votes are usually like 186 to 5 or something, and it's the United States, Israel, and a couple of Pacific islands, which, with respect, I don't think even a lot of people listening to this show would have even heard of before. And these, South Pacific islands often sell their votes to try and pad the stats. So pretty much the entire world is rejecting this genocide and wants peace and wants justice for Palestinians. And because TikTok is more of a global South app than a lot of the ones we have, a lot of the US-based ones that are based mostly in California, it tends to represent that in its content. So I do agree with you that compared to, let's say, Instagram, TikTok does seem like a bastion of pro-Palestine thought. But I'm saying that that is more just because it's a reflection of the reality of how the global public thinks, rather than there's some sort of dastardly Chinese conspiracy to feed anti-Israel propaganda to American youths. And for the last few years, TikTok has been under intense attack from the US government in a way in which that other social media companies were perhaps 8 or 9 years ago. TikTok has really been facing both barrels from Congress and the Senate. And they've responded to that by trying to placate them by doing all sorts of things. In 2020, for example, they launched Project Texas, which was this huge move to move all of this data over to servers in Texas. I think it's in Austin, but don't quote me on the city. And they were going to work with Oracle, which is technically a private company, but it's a CIA-aligned company, which actually got its start working for Project Oracle, which is a CIA project, and pretty much all their contracts are with the US government anyway. And that was a way of trying to placate the United States government into seeing TikTok not as a threat and allowing it to keep going on. But in the last few years, it's come under even more pressure. And part of Project Texas, which wasn't talked about in the media, was that they have been hiring a whole load of people from the US national security state, and indeed a smaller amount from the Israeli national security state as well. So one example of Unit 8200 infiltrating or moving into TikTok is Rayut Medallion. Now, she enjoyed a long career at Unit 8200, serving as an intelligence commander, and was actually head of its cybersecurity operations team. So this is a seriously high-level spying official. And in December 2023, TikTok offers her a job. She moves to New York and becomes a global incident management and trust and safety manager. Now, I would ask you, why would TikTok in December 2023, at the height of the slaughter in Gaza, be offering a job to a senior Israeli military intelligence official? And what sort of global incidents, quote unquote, is she going to be managing for TikTok? I don't think we have to take too much of a leap to put two and two together here. And this sort of TikTok treatment, which they've been going through for the past few years, Actually, this happened to a lot of the other big social media companies in the 2010s. You might remember in the wake of 2016, there was a lot of talk about how Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, all this pro-Trump, pro-Russian propaganda swung the election in favor of Trump. And Mark Zuckerberg was hauled before Congress in DC, and he was threatened with his company being broken up. There were even whispers about Zuckerberg being sent to prison for what he'd been doing. And lo and behold, just a few weeks after Zuckerberg faced the music, Facebook announced that they had entered a partnership with the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank, whereby the Atlantic Council would help Facebook curate the 3 billion news feeds that it controls of 3 billion people all around the world. And that would help create a new algorithm to make sure that the world was promoted trustworthy news and demoted all of this borderline content, which is what they called. And we know what happened. Overnight, alternative media traffic on Facebook crashed, and corporate media traffic to Fox News, CNN, MSNBC went up. And so the real consequence of that, the real casualties of this so-called war on fake news has actually been grassroots independent media who now find it so hard to build a following online because these algorithms are stacked against us in a way in which 10 or 15 years ago was not the case. And we were absolutely, we were wiping the floor with corporate media back then. But since the algorithms have changed, the opposite is now true.
Yeah, it has been devastating by all accounts. And I even remember reading about this in maybe one of Bernie Sanders' books about how negatively it affected. Oh, no, I think it was actually an Ari Robinhoff's book from the campaign about how negatively affected, insurgent political campaigns like Bernie's as well. Taking a bit of a step back, I am personally just very fascinated by all of the sort of media bias stories, and I think they're really important. It is interesting, though, that, over a year into this genocide, it does feel like the character of the pushback is so muted. I mean, I watch these State Department briefings, and it almost feels like their heart isn't even in pretending like a genocide isn't happening anymore, right? It's almost like they're just trying to get through the day at the office without any really real investment in thinking that they're going to change anybody's mind or convince anybody of anything. And so you see the kind of Barack Ravid style sort of media management, which is just to say, yeah, it's bad, but it's not Biden's fault. But I almost don't even, like when I was on Rising, for instance, it was like a daily knockdown, drag out fight over, well, is this fatality, death toll number really accurate? Is it fair to say that Israel would purposefully bomb a hospital? Is it, is Biden genuinely working behind the scenes to try to make it happen? Is every death just actually Hamas's fault, no matter how many times a 7-year-old child is found paralyzed with an Israeli bullet in their back? I mean, those were the fights that we were having really viscerally and that were being had all over the place. And it feels like there's almost a kind of apathy from those who would be defending the government, either because it's gone too far and it's indefensible, or because they've realized that you don't really need the public's approval to continue doing this. And you could argue that maybe Biden lost in part because he didn't have the public approval and they should have done more of this kind of management. But I do wonder if you have any sense like that, like that there's that I have that the value almost of these pieces that are pointing out all of the media bias is almost, I don't want to say it's diminished, but it's almost beside the point because it doesn't really affect anything anymore. People hating what's happening in Gaza either doesn't have a political effect, or people have decided that they're willing to take the political cost because litigating this genocide is more important to them.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's no doubt that the government and pro-Israel factions are still pulling out all the stops to try to present what's going on in Western Asia in a light as favorable as possible to the United States and to Israel. And there's still a fight going on around that. But in some sense, you're right. And what I would agree with you in a sense would be that in some ways, it doesn't really matter what the public thinks. What it really matters is if the public acts on what it thinks. And so we can talk about, say, all sorts of issues where the public uh, has a completely different opinion on an issue to both parties, whether it's like single payer health care or support for elderly people, or more money for children, or a Green New Deal, or whatever it is. Poll after poll shows that the public are broadly in support of these measures, despite the fact that they've never heard anyone on cable news ever talk about this in a positive manner. What really matters is getting people actually mobilized in support of these things, because it's all very well the public all thinking this, but if they don't actually act on it, and if they don't have the movements and vehicles to actually produce change, then it doesn't really matter what they think. And so that's the real key issue for activists, for radicals, for revolutionaries, whatever you want to call them, is actually building movements that can affect change in the country. And I think actually, in the wake of what happened in October and November, when we saw huge nationwide protests all around the United States, all around Western Europe, of millions, tens of millions of people understanding that their governments are complicit in that, shutting down roads, shutting down factories, weapons factories, protesting on campuses across the world. These things really scared the elites to the point where there were huge numbers of billionaires that were, sending messages to the deans of universities telling them to get these student protesters off these lawns immediately, or we'll cut funding. So clearly they did think that these things actually did matter. So what I would say is it's actually not just about proving that the media has a bias, or proving that one side is carrying out a genocide. It's actually about trying to get people out on the streets, get people involved into movements to change those things, rather than just convince them of what they already know.
Between this answer saying that people needed to engage in movements and our earlier kind of joking back and forth about, can I trust handwritten letters once they get rid of USPS? I'm thinking about this article about third spaces that came out today and how important they are. Did you catch any of that?
Third spaces, I'm not
Do you know
even
what
sure
third
what that
spaces
is. You better
are?
enlighten me.
So the idea is that in earlier times in our public history, that people haven't just had their home and their workplaces, but other environments in which they were able to have social interactions with folks. So whether it was churches, which are less, or other kind of religious institutions, which have become less and less popular in an increasingly secular world, whether it's bowling alleys or knitting clubs or Tupperware parties or whatever, that there used to be all of these opportunities for people to be together. And nowadays, with phones and social media, the percentage of time that people spend alone is higher than it has been in yesteryear. And the argument is that Gen Z is increasingly trying to reconstruct that because they're feeling so lonely and isolated, in particular as a generation. And I do wonder, I mean, I have this conversation with people all the time, especially people who are in the media and who feel this. I think there's a kind of there's a dissonance that happens when you are kind of like talking to people all day. It kind of feels like you're messaging to tens of thousands of followers every day. And then you realize that you haven't actually left your apartment and put real pants on and talked to a human being in like 48 hours. This is just a hypothetical. I'm not talking about myself or anything. I'm definitely wearing real pants as I sit here recording this interview. But that is like a really disorienting experience, because it has the veneer of having all the social interaction without having any at all, and that people are trying to strike out and fix that.
100%. Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, th Actually, online interaction is no substitute for face-to-face interaction, is it? I mean, you can create a video and you can be like, wow, I reached, 2,000 people viewed this. Imagine how long it would take for me to talk to 2,000 people in real life at like a public event or whatever. And people say, it's the same thing that we were talking about 10 years ago when people said, oh, you've got 500 friends on Facebook, but how many could you actually call up if you had a real emergency? Not many, right? And it's this since neoliberalism is hollowing out society to the point where we've got almost nothing left, but it can offer us like a simulacrum of friendship in, our Facebook friends, or it can offer us, a simulacrum of activism by reaching people on Twitter with a tweet or whatever. But true organizing happens in the streets. And, I have a Palestinian friend and she says that she's always amazed that actually talking to people face to face, you can get so much more out of that. You can change people's opinions so much easier when you're actually having a dialogue in person than you can when, if you're online. And of course, part of that is by design. We are fed these algorithms which show us what we already believe in, and we're in these like artificially constructed bubbles that keep us in our place. And we have to break out of those because honestly, when you're just preaching to the choir, you do sometimes wonder how much utility you're actually having.
Yeah, people who listen to this podcast know that I've been kind of wrestling with this and sort of like, what's the goal? I love it when people who have some ideological differences with me come on the podcast. I really enjoyed a debate I recently had with Glenn Greenwald. I enjoyed sparring with Michael Eric Dyson, who's has a more liberal orientation. I've enjoyed talking to, Thomas Chatterton Williams or Glenn Lowry or whomever other conservatives have been on the show in the past. I will say it is surprisingly difficult to get people on when they know you're going to disagree. And like one of the, I think, positive features of real life is that you bump into someone in real life. They don't necessarily have your whole Twitter feed in front of you to scroll. And so they're there, they can't escape, and they're willing to engage you because they don't have all these priors as to what you're going to say. And online, when you invite somebody on, that's not the case. They're going to do a quick Google, they're going to do a quick scroll. And a lot of people just don't want that level of conflict in their lives, which I respect and appreciate, but I do think it's less interesting than when we're able to work things through. And that's another advantage of being in real life with a real person. I will say though, I won't knock the internet stuff entirely, but I do think it needs to work in tandem with real life interaction, if only because real life social interaction keeps you sane.
Yeah, 100%. I think I would agree with that totally. But, when you were talking about this, I wonder if that's an outgrowth of all of these videos that were so popular 10, 12 years ago of like, Ben Shapiro owns liberals, 15 million views, or, Christopher Hitchens owns stupid creationists or whatever. Is that, I don't know, maybe we've descended into a very sort of tribal culture like that, where we're not willing to talk to the other side, and we're also not willing to, take the risk of being made a fool of online. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it also makes me think of like the popularity of Joe Rogan, for instance, or any kind of longer form interview. So I think the toxicity of the Ben Shapiro owns whomever is that it's about debate. It's about winning debate. It's about the skill of rhetoric as much as or more than the underlying belief system or who you actually think is right or moral or good in an argument. And you can win a debate being wrong. Like I've watched debates, obviously, where someone that I disagree with clearly won. Whereas longer formats, I think, resist some of the easy conclusions that a debate format invite. And people have talked about how the 7-minute segments on mainstream news also really incentivize kind of glib, punchy, short, simplistic understandings of the world where you can get your dunk in. Whereas over the course of 3 hours where you can stop and Google something and people can reassess their opinions, and like in the Joe Rogan podcast, you get a different kind of vibe. I'm also thinking of like streamers like Hassan Piker, where, you're on with 8 for 8, 10 hours a day or whatever it is. And there's not an expectation that you fill every moment of silence. You can stop, you can Google, you can read people's comments, you can reassess, you can go back and forth. Michael Brooks was like this too when he used to take callers. And I witnessed him change people's minds and have rapport with folks that disagreed with him in a way that felt, genuinely transformative in retrospect. And you could see people liking him and having goodwill toward him, even as they were very much opposed to whatever he was saying. And there was this sense that over time, that relationship mattered even more than whatever the tidbit we were talking about was. And so, yeah, I've just given a bunch of examples of how that can happen online and not in real life, right? But I'm a little, I don't know, on the fence about how much of it is the medium versus the kind of stylistic choices.
Yeah, sure. I mean, listen, we live in a 280 character generation, and a lot of that is really bad for humanity in so
Used to be
many
140.
ways. Yeah.
We're doing better. It used to be 140. I'm old enough to remember.
But people won't even click a video if it's like longer than 10 minutes nowadays, or they just, well, some people won't anyway, or it's just not going to get played. And it's very difficult to actually change someone's opinion, especially multiple people or en masse. If you are talking in, 30-second sound bites, you can't reassess your entire worldview over what someone says in 2 or 3 sentences, right? And actually, people have understood this for generations. In fact, I was reading a CIA document recently. If you don't know, the CIA sponsored the production of just tons and tons of books and plays and journals for decades, all of these anti-communist stuff. And the reason they did that, they said, was that even though these books were not actually read by very many people, they said that the book has the power to change someone's entire worldview in a way in which, a newspaper article or a TV segment just simply doesn't, because you're actually engaging with someone for hours and hours on end. And that kind of long form discourse, whether it's in books or whether it's in, these long interviews that are really popular nowadays, they fill a really important, segment for a lot of people. It's a sad fact, but a lot of people do get their ideology from, streamers. And that's generally not a good thing, even if there are some good streamers out there like Hassan or whoever. People simply are not willing to engage with, big dusty tomes anymore to sort of have a theoretical understanding of the world. I'm, probably as guilty of this as a lot of people, but yeah, I don't want to come across as a crusty old man who says, back in my day we read 1,000 pages before breakfast. But yeah, I think it is kind of a toxic culture where we have to be so concise and we have to drill something down to a couple of sentences or a 30-second video, because ultimately that is not going to benefit people who want to change the system.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's right. Like, I get it, Brianna, you need to write a book, stop procrastinating. It's on my list for 2025. Everybody needs to get off my back. But no, you're completely right. I will say that my observation is that, yes, people want the shorter clip, especially it's like context dependent. So it's on like Twitter. I'm not watching a 10-minute video on Twitter. I barely want to watch 1 minute on Twitter. But I have noticed, like, I used to have apprehension about putting out like a 90-minute, 2-hour video episode on YouTube. Like, who's watching this? Do I need to cut it up into a bunch of pieces? But my experience has been that those longer videos are some of the most successful ones. And it's, again, because I think that this video essay sort of format allows people to engage. If it's a debate, it allows the debate to completely play out without feeling like it's artificially constrained. And people really seem to have an appetite for it. So whatever lessons to take from that, take from it. Alan, I really appreciate you joining me today. Where can the audience find you and your work on the internet and beyond?
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you again, Brianna. I guess you should follow me over at mintpressnews.com. That's where I publish all my long form articles, or often on the podcast or on videos and stuff. I am terminally online, unfortunately, even though we've been talking about how everybody should get offline and speak, touch grass, talk to their relatives, talk to their neighbors. I'm most active on Twitter. You can find me at Alan R. MacLeod. Also on Instagram, alan.r.macleod. And I've also got a Telegram channel as well.
Okay. All right. I do need to touch grass. Do you have a favorite third space? Do you feel like you have one?
Oh yeah, pretty much all my friends are normies. I play a lot of sports. Go down, play a lot of games and stuff with just random people. So yeah, I'm definitely in that third space for sure. The
I
third
went to
space is where it's at.
This is where it's at. I don't have a second space since I don't go into an office anymore, especially post rising. So I'm hard up. I'm struggling. I went with friends to one of those bars. It's like a board game place last weekend, and that was really fun. And I thought, oh yeah, um, I'm an adult, but this is what we have to do now because this childless generation is just like extended adolescence. But it was a lot of fun. And I think speaking of sports, I'm going to join one of those running clubs or one of those in DC. It's called Volo. It's like these adult, again, like kickball, soccer leagues and things like that. I'm inclined to do it for the touching of the grass. This
No,
is
I
my
think you'll get
motivation.
a
I'm
lot out of
speaking it
it.
out loud. I'm manifesting it for the new year, and hopefully there will be rewards. Thank you again,
Yeah,
Alan MacLeod. You've been really delightful. I appreciate it.
I loved every minute of it.
Thanks to you for listening. You can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. As always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith.